Hey guys, it's Chris from Highland Guitars and you're watching another episode of From the Luthier's Workbench. In this episode, I'm going to be wax potting a set of humbucker pickups that I wound for a guitar project that I'm currently working on. So I thought it would be kind of fun to let you take a peek at the process. It's pretty simple. But what I also want to do is explain to you what wax potting is, and then maybe give you a little bit of information to consider when deciding whether or not you need to wax pot your pickups. So let's jump in and get started. When a pickup is wax potted, what exactly does that mean? Well, basically what it means is you take the pickup, and it doesn't matter what kind, it can be a humbucker, a single coil, P90, whatever, and you dip it into a bath of molten paraffin wax. Now, when paraffin wax is in its molten state, it has the viscosity of water. So when you dip the pickup into that molten wax, it will soak into the pickup. It will penetrate deep into the coil windings. And once it has thoroughly saturated the pickup, you can then pull it out and allow that wax to cool. And wherever there was a void, which was previously occupied by nothing but air, there's now wax filling that void. So what happens is you've kind of like encased the pickup in wax. And so why do we do this? Well, when you strum your guitar, the string starts to oscillate, and that excites the magnetic field. And to make a long story short, that's how you generate the electrical signal that is sent to the amplifier and ultimately out of your speakers. Well, not only is that string oscillating, but there's also a physical vibration. And whenever there's a physical vibration that passes through the guitar, it'll also pass through the copper coil windings in the bobbin. And what can happen is if there are air voids between the windings, those windings can vibrate. And when they vibrate, they bounce into one another. And what can happen as a result is you'll get some feedback, squealing coming out of your speaker. To complicate matters, if you're up on stage and you have a big stack of cabinets and a drummer who's bashing away on a drum set and a bass guitarist whose philosophy is to EQ his guitar to 10 and set the volume to 10, and you've also got a singer, maybe a keyboard player, and who knows, maybe 100,000 screaming fans, all of that vibration can conspire to cause those coil windings to vibrate, and that's what gives you just potentially a tremendous amount of squealing feedback. And if you've ever been up on stage playing, you know what I'm talking about when you're playing and all of a sudden, depending on how you move in front of your speakers, you all of a sudden get this loud squealing. And sometimes how you hold the guitar and where your hands are can contribute to generating a situation where feedback comes screaming out of your speakers. So the way we deal with that is to wax pot it. Now, legend has it the whole idea of potting pickups was originated by Eddie Van Halen sometime towards the end of the 20th century. And he was having problems with feedback on stage. And of course, when you look at his stage setup, he had huge speakers and he was playing in gigantic auditorium and stadium type situations. So there was an enormous amount of vibration. And he was having problems with feedback. And Eddie's the kind of guy who's smart enough to know that that feedback was likely happening within the coil of his pickup. So what he did was he took the pickup out of his guitar and he dipped it into a coffee can full of molten paraffin wax, let it soak in, and then let it cool. And when he reinstalled the pickup, problem was solved. And of course, if Eddie was doing it, everybody was going to do it. And pretty soon word got out and everybody started wax potting their pickups. Even people who didn't need to wax pot their pickups were doing it because Eddie was doing it. And nowadays, when you buy a mass production pickup or pretty much any electric guitar out on the market, the pickups have likely been potted. And that's just because you got to do it. If you're going to sell a guitar or a pickup, you pretty much have to wax pot it. Now you can still find some pickups which are specifically advertised as not being potted. And there's a reason for that, and I'll get to that in a second. But that's kind of the reason why we pot pickups. Now, the other question that would come up is, should you pot your pickups? You know, is it something that you really need to consider doing? If you're making your own pickups, or if you've got a guitar that you think, well, these pickups may not be potted, should I pot them? Well, it doesn't hurt anything to pot pickups, but you know, it is something that's going to take a minimal investment of tools and materials, and it could very slightly affect the tone of your guitar. It's not a major impact, but it will have an impact, so you need to keep that in mind. But really, the only reason why you would want to pot your pickups is if you're having a problem with squealing, or if you're making pickups, you want to head off that squealing and feedback before the pickups are ever installed. So it's not, you know, an automatic yes that you should pot your pickups. That's just something you know, it's really the sort of thing that you only want to do it if you have to do it. You know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But when you pot the pickups, you'll follow just a simple process, and I'm going to show you how I do that right now. The technique that I use to wax pot my pickups is pretty straightforward. It's a really simple process, and it's one that I've been doing for a lot of years, and I know there's probably a multitude of different ways to do this, but this way works really well for me. And what I'm using is just a small mini crock pot, and I picked this up off Amazon a number of years ago. I think I paid like 10 bucks for it. So just, you know, do a search for mini crock pots and you'll find them. And this works really well when I'm doing just like 2 pickups. You know, if you're doing a lot of pickups, you'd probably want to use a larger crock pot for that. However, one thing you should be aware of is a crock pot is probably going to take about 30 minutes to an hour to melt the wax to where you can dip the pickups into it. And so it does take a little bit longer. You could also, if you wanted to, melt the wax into a saucepan on a stove. You know, I would recommend going to like your local thrift store, you know, Goodwill or Ark or whatever, and pick up a used saucepan. It's not going to, I wouldn't use a saucepan that you use for cooking your food. Another thing to be aware of is, my understanding is that when you melt this wax, you know, you've got to be fairly careful about overheating it because it is flammable. It can catch fire. That's why I like using the crock pot, because it never really gets that hot. It just gets hot enough to melt to its liquid state. And speaking of wax, I'm just using Gulf Wax household paraffin, which you can pick up at any grocery store where they sell canning supplies. Now, I know there are some people out there who will say, oh, well, I only use a blend of 20% beeswax and 80% paraffin wax. Well, you know, if you want to do that, you want to source 2 different kinds of wax for your potting, by all means, knock yourself out. I've done that before in the past. I found it makes no difference whatsoever. I just use the paraffin. And the way I'll do this is I'll just take my pickups. Now, you'll notice on this humbucker, there's this white substance that has been wrapped around the bobbins. When I wind my own pickups, to protect the coil during the assembly process, I wrap the bobbins in Teflon plumber's tape, and I'll do several windings around, or several wraps around it, and that will protect the coil as I'm assembling it. And then once I have potted it, this Teflon tape actually turns kind of a translucent white color, but then when the wax cools, that tape hardens, so I get this really durable coating over the coil windings, and I think that does a nice job of protecting it. But I'll just set the pickups down into the molten wax here. And as you can see, 2 pickups will fit in there nicely. And make sure that the wax pretty much is covering the whole pickup. Now you may notice some bubbles appearing. And what that is the wax is forcing out the air from the voids and taking its place. So once those bubbles have stopped, you've pretty much saturated the pickup with the wax. But I'll let this sit about 10 to 15 minutes. And that should be enough to thoroughly saturate the pickup. It's been 12 minutes, and I know that because I timed it, since I put these pickups into the bath of paraffin wax. And it looks like most of the air bubbles have stopped appearing. There may be still a few that are popping up on this bridge pickup. So what I'm going to do is just give a little bit of a jostle in the wax. And then I'll let it sit for a few minutes longer just to make sure that I have got all the air out of these pickups and that they are thoroughly saturated with wax before I take them out. It's been about 12 minutes since I started potting these pickups, and the air bubbles have stopped rising to the surface, so I'm ready to pull the pickups out of the bath. However, I've got to be careful here because the wax is in its molten state, which means when I lift the pickup out of the bath, the wax is going to want to pour back out into the pot, and I don't want that. I want as much of that wax to remain in as possible. So I'm going to pull it out and quickly lay it onto the sheet of paper towel that I have next to the pot, and that will help prevent excess wax from pouring out of the pickup. It'll keep it in place. And at this stage, I can just let it sit until the wax is cooled, but before it's cooled for too long, I want to try to wipe off the excess wax from the top of the bobbins. It's just easier to do it now than it is to do it later. Although if it does, if there is excess wax on the surface later on, I can easily just wipe that off with a cloth that's been dampened with naphtha. After I've taken the pickups out of that hot wax bath, I like to check the DC resistance in both just to make sure I have a good signal. You never know, with that kind of heat, something could go wrong, but in truth, I've never really had that happen. And that pickup checks out. And that one does as well too. So both pickups are good. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to let the wax cool. And that's probably going to take 30 minutes to an hour. And when you check the DC resistance right after taking the pickups out of the bath, it's going to be really, really high. And as it cools, it'll get low. So if you know what your resistance is for each pickup before immersing it into the bath, you'll know it's cool when that resistance has returned from a really high reading down to its original pre-wax bath resistance numbers. So that's one way to tell it's totally cool. Another way is just to touch it with your fingers and you can tell when it's cool. Now, I did mention earlier that some guys like to sell pickups that are not wax potted. And you know, you got to figure a lot of the pickups that were made in the 60s and 70s weren't potted at all. And obviously some of the greatest music ever recorded was recorded with pickups that weren't wax potted. So I like to think of it this way. A lot of the pickups, a lot of the really poorly made pickups can benefit from wax potting because poorly made pickups tend to have a looser coil winding. And when you have looser coil windings, that's going to cause those windings to vibrate when you're playing the guitar. And if the windings have been properly tensioned as the bobbins were being wound, you're probably not going to have that kind of an issue. But you know, some guys are selling pickups now that are not wax potted in order to preserve the original unpotted tone of the pickup. And you know, I'm not going to get into that whole does it affect tone kind of thing. I'll let you decide for yourself. So that's kind of where it stands right now. I'm going to let these cool and then we'll come back and I'll do the one final step in this process. And that last step is to wrap up the humbuckers with cloth humbucker tape. And I do this just for aesthetic purposes. It looks nicer. It doesn't really offer any additional protection above and beyond what the Teflon tape that I put on does. So, but it does look nicer. So that's that. They are ready to be installed. Okay, well there you have it. It's a pretty simple process, really. And this works whether you're doing humbuckers or P90s, Strat or Telecaster single coils. You know, anytime you have a pickup that you think is producing a lot of microphonic feedback, consider dropping it into a little mini crock pot full of molten wax, and that might help quiet that pickup down a little. So hopefully you found this video to be useful, and if so, give me a thumbs up. If you have any comments or questions, post those down below. And if you don't already subscribe, be sure to hit that subscribe button. If you're interested in content about anything related to building electric guitars. And to be notified, hit the little bell icon next to the subscribe button. And every time I post a new video, you'll get a notification when that video is ready to watch. And I post them maybe once a week, so it's not like I'm going to be bombarding you with notification emails. So until the next episode, take care, and we'll see you soon.